The engine block of the sedan was still ticking, cooling down in the humid night air. Rain had begun to fall, large, heavy drops that drummed against the metal roof like nervous fingers tapping on a table. Inside the car, 3 men sat in total silence. They weren't looking at each other. They were looking at the wrought iron gates of the estate across the street. The lights in the main house were off. That was the first sign. Usually at this hour, the compound was alive, music, shouting, the clatter of bottles, the roar of imported exotic animals in the private zoo out back. But tonight, the estate was a black void cut out of the jungle. The driver checked his watch. The glow of the dial illuminated the sweat on his upper lip. It was 3 minutes past the agreed time. "He's not coming out," the man in the back seat whispered. "Wait," the passenger said. "He knows," the driver said, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. "Look at the guard tower. It's empty." They all looked up. The silhouette of the watchtower stood against the gray clouds. No cigarette cherry burning in the dark, no movement, just concrete and rain. For years they had served him. They had built his empire brick by bloody brick. But in that silence, in the dark of a Tuesday morning, they realized the truth that had been festering in their guts for months. They didn't want him to come out. They didn't want the meeting. They wanted the lights to stay off, because if the lights came back on, it meant the nightmare continued. Something had already gone wrong, and for the first time, they weren't afraid of the police. They were afraid of what was waiting for them inside that dark house. Before we descend into this story, I want to know where you are right now. Is it late night in Chicago? Early morning in London? Are you driving on a lonely highway or sitting in a room with only the blue light of a screen? Let me know in the comments. Tell me the time and tell me the city. It helps to know we aren't doing this alone. Because the story we are about to tell is about being alone. It is about the terrible, suffocating isolation that comes when you have everything, and yet you have nothing left to lose. Settle in. This is a long road. To understand how a man becomes a ghost while he is still alive, you have to understand the height from which he falls. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was an industry. He was a force of nature that had swallowed a country whole. In the beginning, the men around him, the accountants, the enforcers, the logistical geniuses, they looked at him with awe. He was the golden goose. He was the man who could pave a dirt road with $100 bills and not feel the loss. He built a fortress of loyalty, or so he thought. But loyalty is a currency that devalues quickly when the heat rises. Imagine the room where the decisions were made. Thick mahogany tables, air conditioning humming to fight back the tropical heat, cigarette smoke hanging in blue layers. He would sit at the head of the table, speaking in a voice that never needed to be raised. He spoke of routes, of tonnage, of bribes that cost more than the national budget of small countries. The men around the table nodded. They laughed at his jokes. They kissed his ring. But watch their eyes. In this story, the eyes tell the truth that the mouths refuse to speak. Why do men stay in the orbit of a dying star? Gravity. Fear is a form of gravity. It pulls you in, heavier and heavier, until you cannot move. As the years ground on, the pressure from the outside world became a physical weight. The government, the foreign agencies, the rival cartels, they were closing the circle. But the real threat wasn't the police. The police were a known variable. You could pay them, or you could shoot them. They were simple. The real threat was the silence at the dinner table. The boss moved his operation to a remote prison of his own making, a cathedral on the hill overlooking the city he claimed to love. It was luxury, yes, jacuzzis, soccer fields, chefs, but it was a cage. And when you lock a paranoid tiger in a cage with his keepers, the keepers start to look like meat. This is where the psychology shifts. This is where the men who secretly wanted him dead stopped being associates and started being survivors. Every time the boss called a meeting, the men would check their pockets. Did they have their weapons? Did they have a way out? Did they say goodbye to their children that morning? Think about that stress. Cortisol flooding the system, day after day, year after year. The human body isn't designed for it. The architect would walk into the main hall of the prison cathedral. The boss would be there, wearing a sweater, watching the news on a satellite TV. "Sit," the boss would say. The architect would sit. "Do you think they are talking to the police?" the boss would ask, gesturing vaguely at the city lights below. "Who, patron?" "Everyone. The grocer, the driver, your brother." The architect would freeze. "My brother is loyal." "Everyone is loyal," the boss would say, his eyes never leaving the television screen. "Until they are not." This was the torture. It wasn't physical. It was the slow, dripping erosion of sanity. The boss was projecting his own terror onto everyone around him. He knew he was the villain of the story now. He knew the world wanted his head on a pike. And so he saw a blade in every hand. The men would leave these meetings soaked in sweat, walking out into the cool mountain air, gasping for breath. They would look at each other in the courtyard. No words were exchanged. Words were dangerous. But the look was there, the shared understanding. If he falls, we might survive. If he stays, we are all dead. But it was a cage. And when you lock a paranoid tiger in a cage with his keepers, the keepers start to look like meat. This is where the psychology shifts. This is where the men who secretly wanted him dead stopped being associates and started being survivors. Every time the boss called a meeting, the men would check their pockets. Did they have their weapons? Did they have a way out? Did they say goodbye to their children that morning? Think about that stress. Cortisol flooding the system, day after day, year after year. The human body isn't designed for it. The architect would walk into the main hall of the prison cathedral. The boss would be there, wearing a sweater, watching the news on a satellite TV. "Sit," the boss would say. The architect would sit. "Do you think they are talking to the police?" the boss would ask, gesturing vaguely at the city lights below. "Who, patron?" "Everyone. The grocer, the driver, your brother." The architect would freeze. "My brother is loyal." "Everyone is loyal," the boss would say, his eyes never leaving the television screen. "Until they are not." This was the torture. It wasn't physical. It was the slow, dripping erosion of sanity. The boss was projecting his own terror onto everyone around him. He knew he was the villain of the story now. He knew the world wanted his head on a pike. And so he saw a blade in every hand. The men would leave these meetings soaked in sweat, walking out into the cool mountain air, gasping for breath. They would look at each other in the courtyard. No words were exchanged. Words were dangerous. But the look was there, the shared understanding. If he falls, we might survive. If he stays, we are all dead. Soldiers, police, men in plain clothes with heavy armor. They were swarming the street, quietly, efficiently. The last soldier looked at the boss. The boss was still on the radio, laughing softly at something his daughter said. The last soldier made his choice. He didn't warn him. He stepped back from the window. He placed his rifle on the table. "Patron," he said softly. The boss looked up, annoyed. "I am on the line. I'm going to the bathroom," the last soldier lied. He walked to the back of the apartment. He climbed out the small window into the air shaft. He didn't look back. He left the king alone on his throne. The end of the story is not a battle. It is a collapse. The boss heard the boots on the stairs. He heard the wood splinter as the door was kicked in. He dropped the radio. The connection was cut. He ran, not like a soldier, but like a panicked animal. He scrambled out onto the rooftop. The tile was hot under his feet. The sun was blinding. He looked around. To the north, the mountains he loved. To the south, the city he ruled. But every rooftop around him was occupied. Men with rifles, men with uniforms. They saw their faces, and they realized in that final second that they didn't know these men. They weren't his enemies from the old days. They were just people, young men doing a job. He was no longer a god to them. He was just a target. He raised his gun, not to fire, really, but because it was the only thing he knew how to do. The shots rang out. It wasn't cinematic. It was loud, ugly, and fast. He fell. He lay on the red clay tiles, looking up at the blue square of sky. The noise stopped. The shouting started, distant at first, then closer. "We got him! He's down!" But he didn't hear the words. He heard the wind. He felt the cold creeping into his limbs, and the thought that crossed his mind, the final synapse firing in the brain that had designed an empire of terror, was not anger. It was not fear. It was surprise. "Is this it?" he thought. "Is it this small?" He had expected thunder. He had expected the world to crack open. But the world just kept turning. A dog barked in the distance. A car honked. The clouds drifted lazily. The men who gathered around his body, the men who had hunted him, the men who had secretly wanted this moment for years, they stood over him. They took photos. They smiled. They felt the rush of victory. But as they looked down on the barefoot, bloody man on the roof, the victory felt hollow. He was just a man, just meat and bone. The architect, watching the news hours from a safe house in another country, poured himself a drink. He watched the footage of the body being carried away. He thought he would feel joy. He thought he would dance. Instead, he sat in the chair and wept. Not for the boss, but for the wasted years, for the fear that had eaten the best parts of his life, for the realization that the monster under the bed was just a man that bled like anyone else. The lights in the city flickered on as evening fell. The clubs opened. The music started. The drug deals continued in the alleys, handled by new men with new names. The king was dead, and the world didn't care.
That is the true horror of power. It convinces you that you are the center of the universe. It convinces you that your life, your decisions, your wars are the most important things in existence. But in the end, you are just a story that people get tired of hearing. The silence returns. The rain washes the blood off the roof. The tiles dry in the sun. And somewhere, in a dark room, a new young man is looking at a map, and his eyes are hungry. He thinks he can do it better. He thinks he will be different. He doesn't know yet. He doesn't know that the crown is made of lead, and it will crush his neck just the same. The silence that follows a gunshot is louder than the explosion itself. You might think that when the king falls, the world stops. You might think the birds stop singing, the traffic halts, and the sky turns black. But in reality, that is fiction. That is when the most feared man in the hemisphere hit the roof tiles. The first thing that happened was a radio crackling. A young police officer, breathless, his voice cracking with adrenaline, calling in a code. Then a dog barked 3 streets over. Then the neighbors opened their windows. The body was just a heap of mass. It wasn't a symbol anymore. It wasn't the boss. It was just a heavy object that had to be moved. And this is where the real haunting begins. Because the man was dead, but the machine he built, the machine was still running. The gears were still turning, grinding, waiting for new hands to touch the levers. Let's go there. Let's go to the hour after. The morgue was cold. It smelled of antiseptic and old rust. A fluorescent light flickered overhead, buzzing like a trapped fly. They brought him in on a stretcher. The same man who had worn watches worth more than the building he was now lying in. The same man who had burned millions of dollars just to keep his daughter warm on a cold night. Now he was being tagged. Toe tag. Name. Date of death. Time of death. The coroner was a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He had done this 1,000 times. He didn't care about empires or drug wars. He just wanted to finish his shift and go home to his soup. He looked at the body. He looked at the beard, overgrown and graying. He looked at the soft belly of a man who hadn't run in years until today. "Is that him?" an assistant asked, voice trembling. The coroner didn't look up. "It's just a body, kid. They're all the same on this table." But they weren't the same, because outside the heavy steel doors of the morgue, the city was vibrating. A vibration of relief? Yes, but also a vibration of panic. You see, for 20 years, everyone knew their place. You were with him or you were against him. The rules were written in blood, but they were written. There was order, a terrible, violent order. Now, the map was blank. And in the shadows of the city, in the back rooms of clubs and the basements of safe houses, hundreds of lesser men were looking at their watches. They were licking their lips. They realized that the throne was empty. And they realized that without the monster to unite them in fear, they were about to turn on each other. Let's go back to the architect. Remember him? The man with the ledger? The man who got away? He was thousands of miles away now. He was sitting in a diner in a strip mall in Florida. The air conditioning was freezing. He was drinking coffee that tasted like burnt water. The television in the corner was muted, showing a game show.
Then the screen cut away. Breaking news. The architect saw the image, the grainy photo of the body on the roof. He stopped breathing. The coffee cup hovered halfway to his mouth. He looked around the diner. A waitress was wiping a table. An old couple was sharing a slice of pie. A trucker was reading a newspaper. Nobody else was looking at the TV. Nobody else cared. For them, it was just a headline. For him, it was the end of a lifetime of terror. He put the cup down. His hand shook so hard the coffee spilled onto the formica table, a dark brown stain spreading like blood. He should have felt joy. He should have stood up and screamed. He should have ordered champagne. But he didn't. He felt heavy, because he realized something in that diner, under those harsh, bright lights. He realized that for 10 years, his entire identity had been defined by that man. Every thought, every fear, every plan, every nightmare, it all revolved around the boss. Without the boss, who was he? He was just a lonely accountant in a witness protection program, wearing a cheap polo shirt, eating bad food. He was nobody. The fear had given him purpose. The fear had made him feel important. He wiped the spilled coffee with a paper napkin. He watched the brown liquid soak into the paper, turning it soggy and weak. "Can I get you a refill, hon?" the waitress asked. The architect looked up. He tried to smile. It felt like his face was cracking. "No," he whispered. "I'm done." He left a $20 bill on the table. He walked out into the blinding sunlight of the parking lot. He got into his used sedan. He sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. He waited for the relief to come. He waited for the feeling of freedom. It never came. He looked in the rearview mirror. He checked the back seat. Habit. Just habit. The back seat was empty, but he knew deep down that the ghost would be sitting there for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, in the city where the body lay, the celebration was beginning. But have you ever seen a celebration born of trauma? It doesn't look like happiness. It looks like hysteria. People poured into the streets. They honked horns. They waved flags. They hugged strangers. But look closer at their faces. Their eyes are wide, too wide. Their laughter is high-pitched, bordering on a scream. They are not celebrating because the future is bright. They are celebrating because they survived the past.
And in the police headquarters, the mood was even darker. The men who had hunted him, the search block, were gathering. These were men who had lived in the jungle for months, men who had lost partners, brothers, fathers to the boss's bombs. They cracked open beers. They toasted. To the end, they said. But the captain, let's call him the hunter. The hunter sat in the corner of the office, away from the noise. He was still wearing his tactical vest. It smelled of sweat and gun oil. He looked at the whiteboard on the wall, the diagram of the cartel, the hierarchy, the faces crossed out with red X's. The top spot, the boss, now had a fresh red X over it. The board was done. The puzzle was solved. The hunter felt a pit opening in his stomach. For 3 years, he had woken up every morning with one goal: find him. It was the fuel that drove him. It was the reason he ignored his wife's phone calls. It was the reason he missed his son's birthday. It was the reason he kept going when his knees ached and his mind frayed. The hunt was his life. Now, the hunt was over. He looked at his hands. They felt empty without the weight of the rifle. A young lieutenant came over, grinning, a beer in his hand. "We did it, Cap. We actually did it. What are you going to do now? Take a vacation? Go to Disney World?" The hunter looked at the kid. He tried to imagine himself at Disney World, standing in line, eating ice cream. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a different planet. "I don't know," the hunter said softly. "Well, you're a hero, Cap. Enjoy it." The hunter watched the kid walk away. A hero. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had dug a grave so deep he couldn't climb out of it. He knew something the kid didn't know. He knew that nature abhors a vacuum. He looked back at the whiteboard, at the empty spaces below the red X's, the lieutenants who were still alive, the rivals who were watching from the sidelines. He knew that by tomorrow morning, new names would start filling those blanks. The Hydra hadn't been killed. They had just cut off one head, and where one falls, two shall arise. He took a sip of the warm beer. It tasted like ash. Let's move to the other side of the line. Let's move to the rival cartel, the Gentlemen of Cali. They were different. They didn't wear ponchos and boots. They wore Italian suits. They ran their business like a Fortune 500 company. They were gathered in a boardroom that looked more like a bank than a criminal enterprise. Glass walls, leather chairs, a view of the skyline. The news was playing on a massive screen. When the confirmation came, when the fingerprints matched, the room didn't erupt in cheers. There was just a quiet nod, a subtle loosening of ties. The CEO of this cartel, let's call him the Suit, stood up. He walked to the window. He had spent millions to help the police find the boss. He had fed them intel. He had funded the hunters. Why? Not for justice, not for morality, for market share. "It is done," his brother said from the table. "The routes are open." The Suit nodded. "Yes. We should expand immediately, take the northern corridors before the Mexicans move in." The Suit looked at his reflection in the glass. He looked at the city below. He had wanted the boss dead because the boss was too loud. The boss brought too much heat. The boss made the business look bad.
"Be careful," the Suit said. The room went quiet. "Why?" the brother asked. "We won." "We didn't win," the Suit said, turning around. "We just became the biggest target." He pointed at the TV screen, where the police were parading the body. "Look at that," the Suit said. "The Americans, they need a villain. They always need a villain. For 10 years, he was the villain. He took all the attention. He absorbed all the pressure." He paused, looking at his associates. "Now he is gone, and the Americans still have satellites. They still have agents. They still have budgets to justify." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Who do you think they will look at next?" The room went cold. The leather chairs suddenly felt uncomfortable. The Suit buttoned his jacket. "The umbrella is gone. Now the rain falls on us." This is the phase of the story that history books often skip. They tell you about the rise, they tell you about the fall, but they rarely tell you about the hangover. The hangover is long, it is painful, and it is filled with a specific kind of dread. It is the dread of realization. The realization that the evil wasn't contained in one man. It wasn't a tumor you could just cut out. The evil was in the soil. It was in the water. It was in the desperation of the slums and the greed of the palaces. The boss was just a symptom, and now the virus was mutating. In the weeks that followed, the city changed. The car bombs stopped, yes, but the street murders went up. Why? Because without the central authority, every street corner became a contested territory. Every block was a war zone. The small-time dealers, the teenage hitmen, they were free agents now. No one to answer to, no one to restrain them. The architect read about it in the papers in Florida. He read about the chaos. He stopped reading after a while. He got a job at a hardware store. He mixed paint. He cut keys. He tried to be normal, but every time a customer walked in wearing a leather jacket, he flinched. Every time a car backfired, he dropped to the floor. He went to a therapist once, a nice lady with soft lighting in her office. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said. "I'm afraid of the quiet," he said, staring at his hands. "Because when it's quiet," he said, staring at his hands, "I can hear the ghosts." He never went back. He lived his life in a gray haze. He grew old. He died of a heart attack in his sleep 10 years later. When they found him, his apartment was empty. No photos on the walls, no letters, just a ledger on the nightstand, filled with numbers that meant nothing to anyone else. He had carried the secrets to his grave. But secrets are heavy, and they leave a mark on the soul that even death cannot scrub away. And what of the last soldier, the boy who climbed out the window? He didn't disappear. You can't disappear when you have no money and no skills. He went back to the only thing he knew. He joined the new paramilitaries. He traded one uniform for another, one cause for another. He told himself it was different this time. He told himself he was fighting for something real. But at night, when he lay in his bunk in the jungle, listening to the rain, he would see the boss's face. He would see the look of confusion on the old man's face when the radio went dead. He would wonder if he had done the right thing. He had saved his own skin. That was the law of the jungle. But he had lost his honor. And in the world he lived in, honor was the only currency that mattered. He died 2 years later in a firefight over a shipment of cocaine that wasn't even pure. He bled out in the mud, thousands of miles from home. Nobody knew his name. Nobody knew he was the man who opened the window for history to come in. He was just another casualty in a war that has no end. The story of the men who wanted him dead is not a story of victory. It is a story of exchange. They exchanged a monster for a plague. They exchanged terror for chaos. They exchanged their sleep for survival. And as the years passed, the legend of the boss grew. They made movies about him. They printed his face on T-shirts. Teenagers in suburbs who had never heard a gunshot wore his image like a badge of rebellion. The architect saw one of those T-shirts once at a mall in Miami.
He stared at it, the face of the man who had ruined his life, the face of the man who had murdered his friends. And the kid wearing it was eating a pretzel, laughing with his friends. The architect wanted to scream. He wanted to shake the kid. He wanted to say, "You don't know. You have no idea what that face means. That face is not cool. That face is death." But he didn't. He just walked away. Because he knew that the world loves a monster as long as the monster is safely inside a screen, as long as the monster is dead. But is he? Or does he live on in every decision made out of greed, in every act of violence committed for power? Does he live on in the silence of the room when you realize you have gone too far to turn back? So here we are, the end of the road. The body is dust, the money is gone, the buildings have been reclaimed by the jungle, were turned into theme parks. But the psychology remains. The desire for control, the fear of humiliation, the willingness to burn the world down just to be king of the ashes. That is human. That is eternal. And that is why this story doesn't really end. It just waits for the next cast of characters to walk onto the stage. To understand the full weight of the betrayal, we have to rewind. We have to leave the rooftop. We have to leave the morgue. We have to go back up the mountain, back to the time when he was still alive, still breathing, still ruling from the gilded cage he built for himself. The cathedral. History remembers it as a luxury prison. The news reports talked about the jacuzzis, the disco, the waterbeds, the soccer field. They painted a picture of a holiday resort for criminals. But if you strip away the velvet and the gold faucets, what you are left with is a bunker. And a bunker is just a tomb with a ventilation system. Let's spend some time there. Let's sit in that peculiar, high-altitude fog that blanketed the compound every afternoon at 4 o'clock. The air up there was thin.
It made your chest tight. It made your heart work a little harder just to keep the blood moving. For the men trapped inside with him, the cathedral wasn't a party. It was a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut. Imagine it's Tuesday, just a regular Tuesday in 1991. The boss is bored. There is nothing more dangerous on earth than a bored king with absolute power. He's sitting on the edge of the soccer field. The grass is perfectly manicured, a brilliant, unnatural green against the gray sky. He's wearing sweatpants and expensive sneakers. He wants to play a game. So the game happens. It has to happen. The teams are assembled. On one side, the professional players brought up from the city, blindfolded in the back of trucks. On the other, the boss and his guards. The professionals know the rules. They are the best players in the country. They can thread a ball through the eye of a needle. But they also know the real rule. Don't humiliate the patron, but don't make it look like you're letting him win. It is a psychological tightrope. If they play too hard and the boss looks foolish, they might not go home. If they play too soft and he senses the charity, his pride will be wounded, and a wounded pride leads to silence, and silence leads to the hole. Watch the game. The boss moves slowly. He's heavy, out of breath. He calls for the ball. The professional player, a midfielder who is a national hero, passes it gently. The boss shoots. He misses. The field goes quiet. The boss laughs. Everyone laughs. The guards laugh. The players laugh. The laughter is too loud. It echoes off the concrete walls of the perimeter. Again, the boss shouts. They play for 3 hours. The fog rolls in. The players are freezing, but they are sweating cold fear. Finally, the boss scores, a clumsy goal, stumbling over his own feet. "Goal!" the announcer screams over the PA system. Yes, he hired a professional announcer to narrate his private games. The game ends. The boss is happy. But for the men around him, the lieutenants, the architect, the inner circle, the terror is just beginning. Because now comes the night. The nights in the cathedral were the hardest part. There was nowhere to go. The gates were locked from the inside and the outside. The boss didn't sleep much. He had insomnia. He had nightmares of extradition. So he wanted company. He would summon them to the main living room. A fire would be roaring in the oversized hearth. "Sit," he would say. They would sit. The same faces, the same stories, day after day. Imagine being locked in a house with your boss. Now imagine your boss has a mood disorder and a machine gun collection. Now imagine you haven't seen your wife in 3 months because she is afraid to visit. The conversation would circle like a vulture. Who is loyal? Everyone, Patron. What about Moncada? I heard he bought a new ranch. Where did he get the money? He has done well, Patron, thanks to you. Maybe he is stealing from me. No, Patron, never. Maybe you are stealing from me. The silence would stretch. The fire would pop. This is where the psychological erosion happens. It's not the violence, it's the exhaustion. The men, hardened killers, remember, started to crave the most mundane things. They fantasized about walking to a corner store to buy milk. They fantasized about sitting in traffic. They fantasized about being nobody. One of them, a man known as the Pope, not a religious man, just a nickname for his ability to dispense death like a sacrament, started to lose his hair. Clumps of it would fall out in the shower. He went to the boss one night. "Patron, I need to go down to the city. My mother is sick." The boss looked at him. He was eating a plate of fried plantains. "Your mother is fine."
the boss said. "I called her today." The Pope froze. The boss had called his mother. It was a kindness, and it was a threat. "I can reach anyone. I know where she is. You are here because I allow you to be here." "Sit down," the boss said. "Watch the movie with me." They watched a gangster movie. The boss loved them. He would quote the lines. He would cheer for the bad guys. The Pope sat there, feeling the cold knot in his stomach. He realized then that he was not a lieutenant. He was a pet, and pets get put down when they stop being cute. It was during these long, fog-bound months that the conspiracy was truly born. It didn't start with a plan to kill him. That was too big, too scary. It started with a plan to survive him.
This is a phenomenon called dictator paranoia. When you remove all truth-tellers from your life, your delusions become your reality. The boss believed that he was being robbed. He believed his friends were hiding millions. Why? Because he would have hidden millions. He projected his own nature onto everyone else. The architect stopped the treadmill. He wiped his face with a towel. "We have to open a line," he whispered. "To who? The police?" "No, the police are useless. To the gentlemen of Cali." The Pope's eyes went wide. The gentlemen were the enemy. They were the rival cartel. To speak to them was death. "If we talk to them," the Pope hissed, "he will skin us alive." "If we don't," the architect said, staring at the gray wall of the gym, "he will kill us anyway. At least the gentlemen are businessmen. They deal in logic. The patron, he deals with ghosts." It was the ultimate gamble. Betray the devil you know for the devil you don't. But look at the psychology. Humans crave predictability. We can endure pain if we know when it will end. We can endure war if we understand the objective. But random, chaotic terror, it breaks the mind. The boss had become an agent of chaos, and his men were desperate for order, even if that order came from the enemy. So the first message was sent. How do you send a message from a maximum security prison that is surrounded by the army? You use the laundry. The dirty sheets were taken out once a week. A truck came up the mountain, collected the bags, and drove down to the city. Inside the hem of a pillowcase, the architect sewed a tiny strip of paper. It had no words, just a number, a pager number. It was a message in a bottle thrown into a sea of sharks. They waited. 1 week. 2 weeks. The tension in the cathedral was palpable. The boss was on a rampage. He had found a guard sleeping on duty and had him beaten in the courtyard while the others watched. "Wake up," the boss screamed, kicking the bloodied man. "We are at war. You cannot sleep." The architect watched from the balcony. He felt a profound weariness. "We are not at war," he thought. "You are at war. We are just the sandbags." Then the signal came back. A new supply of toothpaste arrived. Inside one of the boxes, hidden under the cardboard flap, was a mark, a small blue circle. The architect saw it. He felt a jolt of electricity. The gentlemen of Cali were listening. The line was open. Now the dance began. Double lives are exhausting. The architect had to wake up every morning, drink coffee with the man he was betraying, laugh at his jokes, manage his money, and plan his future. And every night he had to encode the secrets of the empire into his mind, waiting for the next laundry truck. He started feeding them small things, routes, names of low-level dealers. He was testing the water. The police raided a warehouse in Queens, New York. 2 tons seized. The boss was furious. He paced the living room, throwing vases against the wall. "There is a rat!" he screamed. "There is a rat in the walls!" The architect sat on the sofa, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "It must be the phones, Patron," the architect said calmly. "The Americans have new satellites." The boss stopped. He looked at the architect. Those eyes, black, bottomless, devoid of trust. For a second, the architect thought, "This is it. He sees it. He sees the lie." The boss narrowed his eyes. "Satellites," he muttered. "Yes, the technology. They are reading the heat signatures." He bought the lie. Why? Because it fed his ego. It was easier for the boss to believe that the United States government was using billion-dollar space technology to catch him than to believe that his friend, the man sitting on his sofa, was selling him out. Ego is a blindfold, and the architect wrapped it tighter around the boss's eyes. But the breaking point, the moment that shattered the cathedral forever, was the night of the Galleon. The Galleon and the Moncada brothers were top lieutenants, partners. They had come up the mountain to discuss the missing money. They thought they were coming to a meeting. The architect knew they were coming to an execution. He tried to warn them. He tried to send a signal down the mountain, but the fog was too thick. The phones were down. They arrived at 8 p.m. They were smiling. They brought gifts, bottles of whiskey, a new leather saddle for the boss's horse. The boss greeted them with a hug, the Judas kiss, they call it. They went into the back room. The heavy oak doors closed. The music was turned up. Salsa, loud, brassy, joyful music. The architect stood in the hallway. He could hear the music, and under the music, he could hear the screams. He stood there for an hour. Think about that. 60 minutes, standing in a hallway, smelling the floor wax, listening to your friends being dismantled. He looked at the guard next to him. The guard was staring at the floor, crying silently.
No one moved. No one intervened, because the gravity of the black hole was too strong. When the doors finally opened, the boss walked out. He wiped his hands on a towel. "They were stealing from us," he said simply. "Have the cleaners come." The architect looked into the room. Just a glance. It was enough to haunt him for the rest of his existence. That night, lying in his bunk, staring at the concrete ceiling, the architect stopped being afraid of dying. He started being afraid of living. He realized that as long as he stayed in this cathedral, he was complicit. His soul was being stained layer by layer until it was completely black. He didn't sleep. He got up. He went to the window. He looked at the lights of the city far below, millions of people sleeping in their beds, safe, ignorant. He hated them, and he envied them. He made a vow to the cold glass. "I will burn this place down, not with fire, but with truth." He would give the gentlemen everything, the accounts, the safe houses, the names of the politicians on the payroll. He would strip the boss naked before the world. He went back to his bunk. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Because he had a secret, and the secret gave him power. The boss was the king of the cathedral, but the architect was the man holding the matches.
The escape from the cathedral, when it finally happened, is often framed as a masterstroke of the boss, a daring evasion of the army. But looked at through the eyes of the inner circle, it wasn't an escape.
It was an eviction. The government finally grew a spine. They sent the special forces to move the boss to a real prison. The boss refused. "They are coming to kill me," he told his men. "We leave tonight." They went out through the back wall, into the fog, into the jungle. The architect walked behind the boss. He was carrying a backpack filled with cash. The mud sucked at their boots. The rain soaked them to the bone. The architect looked at the boss's back, a wide, slumped target in the darkness. He had a gun in his belt. He could end it right there, one shot to the back of the head. He could drag the body back to the special forces. He could claim the reward. He could be a hero. His hand drifted to his waist. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the revolver. His heart thundered. "Do it," a voice screamed in his head. "Do it and be free." The boss stumbled on a root. He grunted. He reached back for help. "Hand," the boss said. The architect looked at the hand that had signed the death warrants of thousands, the hand that had fed him, the hand that had patted his children's heads. He froze. He couldn't do it. The conditioning was too deep. The dog cannot bite the master, even when the master is rabid. He took the boss's hand. He pulled him up. "Thank you, brother," the boss said. "Let's go, Patron," the architect said, his voice hollow. "They are close." He saved the monster, and in that moment he hated himself more than he had ever hated anyone. They disappeared into the trees, and the long, slow death march toward the rooftop began. But let's pause here. Let's look at the psychology of that missed opportunity. Why do we hesitate? Why, when the tyrant is vulnerable, when the abuser is weak, do we reach out a hand to help them? It is the complexity of human connection. We are not machines. We cannot simply switch off loyalty. The architect loved the boss, and he hated him. Both things were true at the same time. It is a cognitive dissonance that tears the mind apart. As they walked through the jungle, the architect knew that he had missed his exit. He was now strapped into the roller coaster until the crash. He looked at the other men, the Pope, the last soldier. He saw the same look in their eyes, the look of men who were walking to their own funeral and carrying the shovel. The jungle was loud with insects. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting vegetation. "Where do we go?" the Pope whispered. "We go to the beginning," the boss said. He meant the slums, the neighborhoods where he started. But the architect knew the truth. They weren't going to the beginning. They were going to the end. And the silence of the jungle seemed to agree. I want you to think about that walk in the jungle. Have you ever stayed in a situation, a job, a relationship, a place, long after you knew it was poisonous, long after you knew it would destroy you? Why did you stay? Was it hope, or was it simply the fear of the unknown? The architect stayed because the unknown was terrifying. At least with the boss, he knew the rules. The rules were cruel, but they were rules. Out there, in the world of the police and the Americans and the gentlemen, there were no rules for men like him. He was a ghost walking. And as the sun rose over the mountains, revealing the valley below, he adjusted the heavy pack of money on his shoulders. The money felt like lead. It was the heaviest thing in the world. We are approaching the final spiral now, the days in the safe houses, the days of eating cold soup and watching the news. But before we get there, take a moment. Stretch your legs. The air in the room might feel a bit heavy. That's normal. We are walking through a graveyard of memories. If you're listening to this in the dark, maybe turn on a small light. Just a small one. Because the shadows we are about to enter, they are long and they are very, very deep. Stay with me. We have to see this through to the end. Next, we look at the women, the wives, the mothers, the silent victims who watched their men turn into wolves and had to clean up the mess. Their story is the quietest and the most painful. Thank you for listening. If you're still here, if you've made it through the darkness with me, take a breath. Look around your room. Appreciate the safety. Appreciate the boredom. Boredom is a luxury. Never forget that. I'm going to leave you now, but I have one question for you to carry into the night. If you were offered the crown, if you were offered the power, the money, the world, but you knew it would end on a rooftop, alone and barefoot, would you still take it? Be honest. The answer might scare you. Good night.